As an OSU fan, I say the reason is because they all went to OU. But that and pro baseball, you can screw up 8 out of 10 times and get paid millions of dollars. So last week we started kind of a transition in our study here. Counting today, we have three more Sundays of class material. And leading up to last week, we had looked at individual items such as creation, the ark, Noah, the wickedness of man. And last week we kind of started with the idea of pretending that we were in a courtroom. Pretending that we have two sides here. We have a prosecuting side, and those are, say, non-believers. Those who do not believe in the Bible, do not believe in creation, do not believe in the global flood. And then you have another side, which is our side, the defending side, who believes in a creator, who believes in an almighty, who believes that there was wickedness and God chose to destroy that wickedness via a flood. And so, acting as if we were in a courtroom, last week we made our opening remarks. We made our opening statement. We laid out our case of defending the flood. And we did it by breaking it down into about 4 different sections. We looked briefly at the duration of the flood. We looked at where did the floodwaters come from, height of the floodwaters, and the devastation of the floodwaters. We used those 4 categories last week in our opening remarks, our opening statement, because that's what the Bible tells us. The Scripture is full. In Genesis between 7 and 8, the Bible lays it out. It tells us days. It tells us height of the water. It tells us who all perished in the flood. So we use that as our foundation of our case. This week and next week, we're going to take our foundation and we're going to expand on it. We are going to take each one of these items. So this week, we're going to look at duration of the flood and where do the floodwaters come from. And we're going to look at evidence, the evidence that exists. Before we do that, I know I'm going to disappoint some people in the class because maybe you've done some research or maybe you've heard a story here or there and you're wanting for me to double down on it and really go into 30 minutes. We have 45 minutes this morning and next week. So if you look at all 4 of those items, we get to spend about 10 minutes per item. This is sounding weird. I don't know. Is this good from y'all's end? Okay. So we get 10 minutes. I will tell you with all 4 of these categories, we could spend a Sunday each. I'm not volunteering for 4 or 5 more Sundays. So I know Keith has an outline. He has other teachers and we have other topics. I want to challenge you, just like with any lesson we hear at church, don't take what the individual standing behind the podium says. We've all been challenged to read Scripture, to study ourselves, to research ourselves. My plan, my hope is over the next couple of weeks and showing evidence and bringing some of this stuff to light, that I scratch enough of the surface that you leave here saying, what more is there? Because I will tell you that in the next 90 minutes between this week and next week, we will just literally scratch the surface. James Hamilton has given me some information we're going to touch on next week, and I know he'll be an individual that will recognize I only scratched the surface. So I challenge you, take the information that you hear, write it down, take notes, put it in your memory bank, go home, research it, look at it, because the evidence, it is literally a flood of evidence. So this week we are going to start laying out the case for the duration of the flood. So a couple things that we need to remember, right? Something that we talked about last week. Let's come back and rehash our facts. Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month of the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. So we have the second month of the 17th. On the 17th day, the flood began. We go to 7:24. We see that water prevailed on the earth for 150 days. That would take us to the 7th month, 17th day. 8:4. We see that the ark rested in the 7th month on the 17th day. So both Genesis 7:24 and 8:4 take us to the same time and place. We see in Genesis 8:5 that the top of mountains were seen on the first day of the 10th month. Genesis 7, so we know that on chapter 7, verse 11, it was in Noah's 600th year. We go down to Genesis 8:13, we see it's Noah's 601st year. In the first month of the first day, the ground was dry. And I want to read that real quick and make a note. And it came to pass that in the 601st year, in the first month, on the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. So we know that the surface was dry, but if we go to verse 14, and in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried, and following that, God spoke, and Noah's family, and the livestock exited the ark. I think there's a difference here. The one thing we need to look at and think about is there was roughly a 2-month period, January, February, the first day of the first month to the 27th day of the second month, that we see it went from dry, and then it was dry again. A rainstorm happens, you go outside, right? Your car's dry maybe, the sun's out, but you walk across the grass and it's still a little soggy. I believe that things were drying out, but I don't think that it was dry enough for Noah and them to leave until the second month, 17th day. So Noah, based off of these few scriptures, Noah and his family and the animals spent 1 year, 10 days on the ark. They started on the second month, 17th day of Noah's 600th year, and they exited the ark in the second month on the 27th day of Noah's 601st year. So the question then becomes, what evidence do we have to support this claim, right? This is us as Christians, this is us as believers sitting here saying the duration of the flood went a full calendar year plus 10 days. It's our job to prove that evidence. It's our job to back up that claim. We believe the Scripture. We believe in the Almighty. There's a lot of non-believers who do not, so we need to prove it. So we go to Legends of the Flood. I'm going to read some information that I received or I've looked at and I've studied from the, what I'm going to say today, what I'm going to quote is from the Apologetics Press. It's an article titled Legends of the Flood. It was dated November 1 of 2003. However, I have other study material that I've researched that matches in line with this. So I'm just going to read straight from the article. Legends have been reported from nations such as China, Babylon, Mexico, Egypt, Sudan, Syria, Persia, India, Norway, Wales, Ireland, Indonesia, Romania, etc., composing a list that could go on for many pages Although the vast number of such legends is surprising, the similarity between much of their content is equally amazing, James Perloff noted. So I've got the following up on the screen here. In 95% or more of the 200 flood legends, in 95% the flood was worldwide. So we have over 200 legends of the flood. 95% of them, the flood was worldwide. 88%, a certain family was favored. 70%, survival was by means of a boat. 67%, animals were also saved. 66%, the flood was due to wickedness of man. In 66%, the survivors had been forewarned. 57%, they ended up on a mountain. 35%, birds were sent out from the boat. And in 9%, exactly 8 people were spared. So those are floods. Those are different legends. I've printed off a little bit of that. So let's look at some of these legends, right? We have a belief. Do other civilizations back up a claim of a worldwide flood? American Indian legends. The Aztecs tell of a worldwide global flood in the story with striking parallels to the biblical deluge. Only 2 people, the hero Coxcox and his wife, survived the flood by floating in a boat that came to rest on a mountain. Then soon after the flood, giants constructed a great pyramid in an endeavor to reach the clouds. That's the Aztecs. In the ancient land we now refer to as Mexico, one tribe of Indians known as the Toltecs told of a great flood. In their legend, a deluge destroyed the first world 1,716 years after it was created. Only a few people escaped the worldwide flood. Let's move on. Let's go to ancient Greek mythology. According to the Greek legend of a deluge, humans became very wicked. Zeus, the leader of the many gods in Greek mythology, wanted to destroy humans by a flood and then raise up another group. However, before he could do this, a man by the name of something I can't pronounce, him and his wife were warned of the impending disaster. The fortunate couple was placed in a large wooden chest. What do we talk about with the ark? The ark is referred to as a chest, right? Moses was put in an ark. Noah was put in an ark. And for 9 days and nights, the floodwaters covered almost all the earth. Only a few mountain peaks remained. The wooden chest came to rest on the peak of a mountain. Later, they left the wood chest and made a sacrifice to Zeus. Chinese. So real quick, we've talked about American Indians. We've talked about Mexico. We've talked about ancient Greek. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, China, Asia. We know that there was a lot of missionary work from the Bible done in Asia. But when we think of the Chinese people today, we think communist, right? We think non-Christians, non-believers. Chinese. In the land of China, there are many legends about a great flood. One of those came from a group of people known as Nasu. According to their legend, God sent a personal messenger to earth to warn 3 sons that a flood was coming. Only the youngest son, Dum, heeded the message and constructed a wooden boat to prepare for the coming flood. When the waters arrived, he entered his boat and was saved. After waters began to recede, the boat landed on the mountains of Tibet, where Dum had 3 sons who repopulated the earth. Interestingly, even the Chinese caricature of a boat. So I know you cannot see this, and I know nothing about the Chinese language. I know its symbols. So what we have is the for the boat, the symbol of boat in Chinese, it takes 3 characters to create that symbol. You have to write the character of a vessel, you have to write the number 8, and you have to write the word mouth. So their boat in Chinese represents a vessel with 8 mouths, with 8 people. For a communist country to use that logo, I'd say that's pretty good evidence that the flood was worldwide. We have ancient Babylonian mythology. These are just 3 or 4 that, once again, like I said when we first started, I want to scratch the surface and have you go do further research. I'd make a good lawyer, right? Hey, jury, I'm going to scratch the surface with evidence. It's your job to go home tonight and do more research. So concluding the flood of the legends, what is significant of the various flood legends? Once again, this came from the Apologetic Press. What is the significance of the various flood legends? The answer seems obvious. We have well over 200 flood legends that tell of a great flood. Many of these legends come from different ages and civilizations that could not possibly have copied any of their similar legends. The legends were recorded long before any missionaries arrived to relate to them the Genesis account of Noah. That is one thing that we need to keep in mind. When you look at, today we looked at Aztecs, we looked at Mexico, we looked at Greek, we looked at China, Asia. They're not side by side on the world, they are spread out. And they all have an account. And these accounts, these legends go back farther than missionary work as we spread the good news. Almost all civilizations have some sort of flood legend. The conclusion to be drawn from such facts is that in distant past there was a colossal flood that forever affected the history of civilization. Those living soon after the flood did not have the book of Genesis to read to their descendants. The account of the flood was passed from one generation to the next. Many parents and grandparents told their children and their great-grandchildren about the huge ark, the wonderful animals, and the devastating flood, long before the Genesis record ever existed. Over the years, the details of the story have altered, but many of the actual details remain the same. So what we know is that there was a flood, there was an ark, and 8 people were on it, right? The ark lands on Mount Ararat. God pulls them off the ark, tells them to exit, and says, repopulate the earth. Now, why do we have over 200 legends? Why do we have legends from multiple areas? I would think that when you have been on a 3-hour tour, that most of those people you're with have the same language. Let's go to Genesis 11:1 real quick. The Tower of Babel. The whole earth had one language and one speech. Right? So here we are, Tower of Babel. After a couple chapters later, we see that God is getting a little concerned. People are starting to build up buildings. They want to lay bricks. So let's go down to 11:7-9. So God says, come, let us go down, and therefore confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad all over the face of the earth. That right there is where the legends of the flood comes from. And this goes back to to thinking of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the gospel. All right? We have a lot of critics say, well, they don't match each other. Mark's account is different than Luke's account. Think about if Matt, you and I, we go to Beggs every year has a fundraiser for the baseball team. It's a community event. It's baseball bingo. You all go have fun, eat food, and it's a good time. And Sunday, we come to church. Matt could give some examples of what he witnessed that night, how fun it was because he won bingo and received a nice big Yeti cooler, and food was great, and Rachel and I show up, and because we have 4 kids, we're late and we eat cold food, and because we're having to help our kids, we don't win any gifts, right? Our takeaway would be a little bit different. He's not a liar, I'm not a liar, it's just 2 different facts. It's the same thing we have to think about when studying the gospel. It's the same thing we have to think about when hearing about floods of legend. We have people who have their languages changed, and they've been dispersed all over the world. And when we looked at the flood happened 1,600 years or so after creation, here we are in the year 2022. I would say that stories are going to change a little bit over time. But at the end of the day, throughout the entire world, there are over 200 legends of the flood that corroborate each other's story.
Zach?
Yes, sir.
I just want to remind everybody, too, at that time, there's only one continent on the entire, there's one supercontinent. Genesis 10 says that the earth divided. And so we have Pangea that occurred afterwards. To find these stories all around the world on different continents now, it's not a big thing at all. If you remember that at this time, there's only one continent on the earth.
Yes. See, Keith did his research pre-class. What about flood rock? Okay, so if we had a flood, if we had something that lasted a year. Now we need to break this down. We need to think about it for just a second. From Scripture, back in Genesis 7 and 8, the flood happened in 2 ways. From a time standpoint, we have the flood, the original flood, right? The rain, the heavens opened up, the fountains of the great deep opened up, the water is inundating earth. 150 days. Then we see it receding. The water has to recede. We know that the flood started 2nd month, 17th day. It goes up to the 7th month, 17th day, and then it starts to recede. We know that the top of mountains were seen in the 8th month after the flood started. We know the ground was dry 11 months after the flood started, but not dry enough to leave. And we know that Noah left the ark a little over a year after entering. Now the land was dry enough. So the 2 things at play are the catastrophic flood event for 150 days or 5 months, and water receding and land drying out for 7 months. When the fountains of the great deep opened, as outlined in Genesis 7:11, the earth began to change, therefore creating geological layers. As water receded, additional geological layers were formed. So what is a geological layer? What are we talking about when we talk about a geological layer? It's vertical columns of rock stacked. Geological layers are generally stacked in a vertical column with different layers being made up of similar rock sizes. Do we have any science teachers in here? Science? No? No? We got a couple of principals now. No, haven't been that long. So, science experiment. We take a jug. I tried it yesterday. I just didn't have the right type of gravel. I realized kitty litter's not really rock. It absorbs. I thought what I had in this bucket was sand. We had taken to Colorado one time during the winter storm. I thought, yeah, there's some sand. Grab it, throw it in there, and then all of a sudden it starts like swelling. That wasn't going to go good for my science experiment today. Take a jar, a big jar, and put rock in it and sand in it and water and move it around, right? And let it settle out. What's going to go to the bottom? Your heavier rock or your lighter rock? Heavier rock? Heavier rock's going to fall. Some of the smaller stuff will get trapped and be mixed in there, but for all intents, if we go, okay, let's go to a pool, and you have a cup of big rocks and a cup of sand, you pour it into the pool, what's going to get to the bottom first? The big rock, the gravel, right? That's what we need to think of with the geological layers. What I have up here is a chart that I found. There are 2 or 3 different charts I've seen. We'll briefly talk about some of these. Both creationists and evolutionists generally agree that the layers below another layer are older and the layer above are younger. And when you think of geological layers, you need to think of them as depth, not a representation of years. So for a long time, we've been told millions of years, millions of years. We have evolutionists and creationists now coming together to say it's more of a age difference, all right? So the lower ones, the ones on bottom are older, are heavier. The ones that are on top are newer or are younger. And we're losing, we are winning the battle when it comes to evolutionists. Most can agree that, you can see that. That the pre-flood layer was pre-Cambrian, and then about the beginning of the flood was the Cambrian layer. And then up through the end of the flood, you have the worldwide layer, the Cretaceous. So right below that, you have the Jurassic layer. What you see a lot of times there, that's where you can find a lot of your fossils. Keep that up there. So when you see the word mounts of Ararat, these are actual layers that are found on that mountain. And the upper portion, the blue portion, how it says end of flood, that's kind of a snapshot of Mount of Ararat, that mountain range pulled off to the side, and what their layers look like. But what we see is with rock layers, geological layers, are the lower rock level are inverted and the upper ones aren't. So we're down, lower layers, we're not disturbed, and the higher up you go, we start getting rocks turned over, right? So what is something that we could look at to look at the rock layers and prove it? There are 2 things I want to say real quick. One, well, there's 3. Number 1 is next week we're going to look at Mount St. Helens and its eruption. That is going to help explain how rock layers happen. Number 2 is if you get on YouTube and you look up, is Genesis history? These guys do a phenomenal job of going through, speaking with scientists about the earth, about Genesis. They're phenomenal. So I would recommend if you want to go home and do some more study on is Genesis and it being history, watch them on YouTube. The next thing would be the Grand Canyon. So the Grand Canyon is somewhere here in the U.S. that we can use as a modern day classroom. The Grand Canyon is anywhere from 4 to 18 miles wide, 1 mile deep, and 275 miles long. The Grand Canyon offers a ton of geological information with regards to erosion, power of water, evidence of volcanoes, rapid sedimentation, and geological rock layers. We're going to talk a lot about sedimentation, rapid sedimentation, and rock layers next week when we look at Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens, because of its eruption in the early 80s, has been a huge as far as changing a lot of evolutionist mindset about aging. So we can look at the Grand Canyon though, and at the bottom by the river we have what are called basement rocks. So it's granite, schist, and gneiss rocks. These rocks form the core of the continent down deep. They are non-stratified rock. They are down at river level, below river level. Setting on top of that rock layer, now I want to say real quick, this information that I have, I pulled it from several sources I looked at, but none of them were biblical sources, all right? So we have non-biblical providing this source, which proves our biblical evidence. The Grand Canyon, on top of the bottom, on top of the basement rocks, we have what are called supergroup rocks. They set above the basement rocks and below the Great Unconformity. Those are also non-stratified rock. They've not been changed. They've not been disturbed. The Great Unconformity is an erosion surface separating non-stratified and stratified rock. That is the line. Anything above the Great Unconformity is quite different. A 4,000-foot line, a strata line of beveled surface made up of shale, limestone, and sandstone all the way up to the rim of the Grand Canyon. That 4,000-foot strata of shale, limestone, and sandstone forms a broad blanket that can be seen across the world, meaning you can go throughout the world, and at that same elevation, within that 4,000 foot, you can go to Mexico, you can go up to Canada, you can go to the U.S., you can go to another country. You're going to see a lot of the same rock at the same elevations. That represents the flood, deposition of fast-moving water. On top of the Grand Canyon, you have what's called the Grand Staircase, which is about 2 miles thick or 10,000 feet. And that was formed by floodwaters that receded. So you have to think when the flood came, it did a lot of carving and cutting and moving. And then as waters receded, we did a lot of settling. Unbelievers state that the Colorado River has cut the Grand Canyon. It winds its way through there, and over millions of years, the Colorado River has cut the Grand Canyon down to what we see today. Go back to as early as we can, 150 years back, we start seeing photos of the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. And we have a lot of creationist geologists who are wanting to prove their case that the Grand Canyon was created by the flood, and they start looking at old pictures 150 years ago, and they take a snapshot today. The boulder that was in the picture 150 years ago is still sitting there. There's some pictures of rapids 150 years ago. You take the same picture today, and the rapids still look the same. So we have 150 years of evidence where the Colorado River has not changed the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is a layered cake of sediment 3 miles thick, right? So we have the Grand Canyon being 1 mile deep, and we have the Grand Staircase sitting 2 miles above. So we have a total of 3 mile thickness of a layered cake of sediment, and it happened rapidly. The Grand Canyon was cut by a great force that not seen in modern day history or recorded by man. This is why Mount St. Helens study next week is going to be crucial to our proving a global flood. The Grand Canyon, every one of us, when we were born, the Grand Canyon was there. Every one of us have relatives that have gone. We have pictures, and 150 years the Grand Canyon has not changed. You get the eruption of Mount St. Helens in the early 80s, and landscape changed dramatically. That was a catastrophic event that came in and changed the landscape, and at the end of it, what we're seeing now is it is proving what we're seeing in the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon was created by a catastrophic event, the global flood of Genesis. So, going to our second point, last week we talked about where do the waters come from. We looked at, right, laying our foundation, Genesis 7:11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month of the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. We see in Genesis 8:2 that the fountains of the great deep were stopped and the windows of heaven were stopped and the rain from heaven was restrained. So we clearly have multiple sources of water. From last week, we need to remember that the earth is considered the blue planet because we're made up of 70% of water. And last week we looked at windows of heaven, referring to God pouring out in abundance. We have Malachi 3:10, where we see God pouring out in abundance. So typically when we have a flood event, we're running out of time. That clock is not a fan of mine. So when we think of a rain event, we think of water coming down from above, right? We experienced flooding in May. Wyoming experienced it in June. Kentucky experienced it in July. We see water coming down. The ground is saturated. The ground cannot absorb the water anymore. It starts setting on top. Once water starts puddling, it starts rising. It starts surface flowing. We go to creeks, rivers, ponds, etc. And then we have devastation with flooding. I do not want to take up any of our time talking about water from above because we see that on a monthly basis. So let's talk about fountains of the great deep. Right? We see that in Genesis 7:11 that the fountains of the great deep were broken up. What would that refer to? So fountains of the great deep. Let's look at some evidence of underground water. The simple answer is yes, that we have evidence. The long answer is it would take us multiple weeks to provide all the data. So I want to take our time this morning, what short time we have left, and I want to look at 3 or 4 locations with underground water, fountains of the deep. Big Spring in Ozark National Scenic Riverway in southern Missouri is the largest spring in central United States. The following information I took from the National Parks Service website. Big Spring is sometimes called America's biggest spring, but there's 3 contenders for the title. Big Spring, Idaho's Snake River Spring Complex, and Florida's Silver Spring. Since the flow from spring varies with local rainfall, many of these 3 could be the biggest at any time. In any case, at average, daily flow of 286 million gallons of water, Big Spring is an awesome sight and a geological wonder. Underground passages carry water from as far as 45 miles away to emerge at the spring. Studies have shown that the water is carrying a load of dissolved limestone equivalent to 70 tons a day. This dissolved rock gives the spring its color and is also carving out huge conduit underground. Should the spring ever go dry, a cave will be a result. A cave will be the result. Well, let's go to Mammoth Cave National Park. In Kentucky has over 400 miles of surveyed passage and has a karst landscape. We went here in early July. We went 300 foot down low. We experienced dark. They turned out lights. It was dark, dark. This landscape is where water moves rapidly underground by dissolving rock. Limestone is a common soluble rock, and karst landscapes are found throughout the United States and the world. Mammoth Cave's karst landscape is part of one of the nation's largest regions of cavernous rocks. Caves and springs commonly occur in the karst regions like Kentucky, southern Missouri, and Florida. So we see Big Spring. What happens if Big Spring dries up with its underground water? It forms a cave. What do we see at Mammoth Cave National Park? We have caves with a little bit of water flow, not a whole lot. Water dried up. What did it leave behind? Caves. Yellowstone National Park, the world's first national park, opened in 1872. Once again, this came from the National Park Service website. I am trying to use non-Christian sources here to prove our case. Old Faithful is one of nearly 500 geysers in Yellowstone and one of 6 that park rangers currently predict. Thermal features change constantly, and it is possible Old Faithful may stop erupting someday. Geysers and other thermal features are evidence, right? Evidence of ongoing volcanic activity where beneath the surface, and change is part of the natural system. That's coming from our government. What's a geyser? It's a spring characterized by intermittent discharge of water, ejected turbulently and accompanied by steam, as a fairly rare phenomenon. The formation of geysers is due to particular hydrological conditions that exist only in a few places on the earth. Volcanoes. Coming from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, volcanic eruptions occur only in certain places and do not occur randomly. This is because the Earth's crust is broken up into a series of slabs known as tectonic plates. These plates are rigid, but they float on a hotter, softer layer of the Earth's interior. As the plates move, they spread apart, collide, and slide past each other. Almost most of the active volcanoes we see on land occur where plates collide. The greatest number of Earth's volcanoes are hidden from view. Where? Why? Because they occur on the ocean floor along spreading ridges. A marine geologist at NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, the lead of the Earth's Ocean Interaction Program, who is a lead author on the study, said the following. We know that most of the world's volcanic activity actually takes place in the ocean, but most of it goes undetected and unseen. In the last 30 years, scientists utilizing improving technology and exploration methods have detected evidence of about 40 undersea eruptions. So in the last 30 years, they've seen 40 eruptions. This research is important as undersea volcanoes can help us inform us about terrestrial volcanoes, their work, and how they impact ocean chemistry, which can significantly affect local ecosystem. If you could give me about 2 more minutes, please. Fountains of the deep. So we've looked at fountains of the deep, right? We see it in Scripture, fountains of the deep. How do they play a role? Just going on the government websites, National Park Services, NOAA's websites, these are some words that we have heard today. Big Spring has an average daily flow of 286 million gallons of water. It carries a load of dissolved limestone equivalent to 70 tons a day. Mammoth Cave, water moves rapidly underground by dissolving rock. Old Faithful is an ongoing volcanic activity beneath the surface, and change is part of the natural system. Geysers they are a spring characterized by intermittent discharge of water ejected turbulently and accompanied by steam. The greatest number of Earth's volcanoes are hidden from view. Why? Because they occur on the ocean floor along spreading ridges. As undersea volcanoes can help inform us about volcano work and how they impact ocean chemistry, which can significantly affect local ecosystems. When we think of the flood, it was a catastrophic event. It did not rain. This was not a April shower brought Mayflower event. This was catastrophic. Genesis 8, 23 and 24. The event was so catastrophic. What did God want to do with it? 7:23. He destroyed all living things which were on the face of the earth, both men and cattle, creeping things and birds of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. This was not an easy event. Our little John boat would have capsized. Government websites, national park systems prove the case of fountains of the deep. Thank you for giving me a couple of extra minutes. Next week, we're going to look about the evidence part 2, a flood of evidence part 2, and we're going to look at, once again, how much evidence is there. Thank you.